They sent her away to marry a monster, as a joke. Not because they loved her. Not because they needed her. But because, in their eyes, she was the family's embarrassment. In a small Appalachian town where church bells echoed every Sunday and rumors traveled faster than the river after rainfall, Emily Carter grew up knowing she was the afterthought. The quiet one. The awkward one. The daughter who asked too many questions and never quite fit the mold her parents had carefully shaped for her older siblings. When people in town whispered about the man who lived alone on Black Ridge Mountain, they spoke in lowered voices. They said he was violent. They said he hated visitors. They said something terrible had happened to his first family. And Emily's parents laughed. Wouldn't it be something, her father once joked at a cookout, smoke from the grill stinging Emily's eyes, if we sent her up there to fix him? The laughter that followed was light, careless. But jokes have a way of turning into decisions when pride is involved. And in the spring of 2008, after a public argument that left her mother red-faced outside the local diner, they did exactly that. They arranged a marriage between their 22-year-old daughter and the man on the mountain. His name was Daniel Brooks. 38. A widower. A carpenter who kept to himself. The town believed he was unstable. Emily's parents believed it would teach her a lesson about gratitude. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Daniel Brooks was not the monster in this story. And by the time the truth surfaced, it had already carved permanent scars into more than one life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now ask yourself this: what kind of family sacrifices their own daughter to protect their reputation? And what kind of man lives alone on a mountain for 5 years and allows the world to believe he's something terrifying? The answers are not simple, and they are not comfortable. 6 months before the wedding, Daniel had already endured more loss than most men twice his age. His wife, Sarah, had died in a car accident during a winter storm. Police reports from that December confirmed the road had iced over near Miller's Bridge. 3 vehicles skidded that night. Only one life was lost. After the funeral, Daniel stopped attending church. He stopped visiting town. He kept working, taking on carpentry jobs through phone calls and delivering finished pieces himself without lingering. People interpreted his silence as hostility. "He barely looks you in the eye," the grocery clerk once muttered. But grief often looks like distance. Emily, meanwhile, had just dropped out of community college after failing 2 classes. "You're wasting our money," her mother had snapped, slamming a cabinet so hard a chipped mug shattered on the tile floor. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and resentment. Her older brother was engaged. Her sister was pregnant. And Emily felt like a loose thread in a family that valued appearances over honesty. When the proposal was presented, it wasn't romantic. It wasn't even kind. "He needs help," her father said flatly at the kitchen table. "And you need direction." She stared at the wood grain beneath her fingertips and asked quietly, "Do I have a choice?" Silence answered her before her mother did. "This will be good for you." How would you have responded in that moment? Would you have fought? Or would you have convinced yourself that maybe they were right? The wedding was small and uncomfortable. Daniel stood stiffly in a borrowed gray suit. Emily wore her cousin's altered dress. There were no bridesmaids, no band, no laughter that reached the eyes. When the pastor asked if anyone objected, the room held its breath for a second too long. No one spoke. Afterward, Daniel drove her up the narrow gravel road to his cabin. Pine trees lined the path like silent witnesses. The house itself was modest but clean, smelling faintly of sawdust and cedar. Inside, there were framed photographs turned face down on a shelf. Emily noticed but didn't ask. That first night, she slept on the far edge of the bed, fully clothed, listening to the wind scrape branches against the roof. Daniel did not touch her. In the morning, He cooked eggs and left them on the table before heading to his workshop behind the house. Days turned into weeks. He kept his distance. He spoke gently when he did speak. "You don't have to stay in the house all day," he told her once. "There's a trail behind the ridge. It's quiet." He never raised his voice. He never demanded anything. The monster the town described did not appear. Instead, there was a man who folded laundry carefully and avoided eye contact when grief caught in his throat. And Emily began to notice something unsettling. She felt safer on that mountain than she ever had in her childhood home. What does that say about the place she came from? 3 months into the marriage, Emily found the photographs face up. Daniel had finally returned them to the shelf. A smiling woman with auburn hair. A little girl with missing front teeth. Emily froze. She hadn't known about the child. That night, she asked him. His hands trembled slightly as he explained. Her name was Lily, he said, voice breaking. She was 6. The accident hadn't just taken his wife. It had taken his daughter. The town had assumed he was violent because he never corrected them. He let them believe whatever they wanted because correcting rumors meant reopening wounds. Emily felt something shift inside her then, a mix of guilt and recognition. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And for the first time, Daniel looked directly at her. "You didn't do this," he replied. Over the next year, something unexpected grew between them. Not passion born from fairy tales, but companionship forged through shared isolation. She helped him sand wood in the workshop. He listened when she spoke about feeling invisible in her own family. On Sundays, instead of church, they hiked to a clearing where wildflowers pushed through stubborn soil. One afternoon, she laughed, really laughed, and covered her mouth in surprise, as if joy were something she had to apologize for. "Have you ever realized that the person you were warned about was the only one who truly saw you?" 2 years later, Emily received a call from town. Her father had suffered a stroke. She and Daniel drove down the mountain together. In the hospital room, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Her mother looked smaller than she remembered. There was no apology, but there was a crack in the armor. "You look, well," her mother said quietly, as if the word tasted unfamiliar. Daniel stood respectfully near the window. When her father regained partial speech weeks later, he avoided Daniel's gaze. Perhaps shame is hardest to express when it's deserved. 6 months after that, Emily and Daniel started a small woodworking business online. Orders came slowly at first, then steadily. By 2013, they were shipping handcrafted tables across 3 states. The town that once whispered now boasted about local craftsmanship. No one mentioned Emily Carter had always been the gentle one. The kind of woman who remembered the stray dog's feeding schedule better than her own birthday. The kind who read novels under the covers with a flashlight at 16 because stories felt safer than conversations at the dinner table. She wasn't loud enough for her father's approval or polished enough for her mother's standards. In a town where reputation was currency and Sunday service was a runway for pressed suits and rehearsed smiles, the Carter family thrived on appearance. Her mother chaired charity luncheons. Her father sponsored local fundraisers and made sure everyone knew it. Her older siblings fit neatly into that picture, engaged early, employed quickly, admired publicly. Emily, with her second-hand dresses and unfinished degree, disrupted the symmetry. They didn't hate her. That would have required emotion. They were embarrassed by her. And embarrassment, in a small town like this, was treated like a stain that had to be scrubbed out before neighbors noticed. So when whispers about the man on Black Ridge Mountain became the town's favorite cautionary tale, the Carters saw opportunity instead of danger. "It's practical," her father insisted. "He needs a wife. You need structure." Structure. As if marriage were a disciplinary tool. As if her life were a loose object that needed tightening. Deep down, Emily believed this wasn't about love or compatibility. It was about control. About correcting the daughter who didn't perform on cue. And maybe you've felt that before, the quiet understanding that your future was being negotiated in rooms you weren't invited into. The town itself sat in the valley like a postcard, white church steeple, a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and syrup, hardware stores with bells that chimed when you opened the door. Above it all loomed Black Ridge Mountain, thick with pine and shadowed even in late afternoon sun. Children dared each other to hike halfway up before running back breathless with invented stories. Teenagers claimed they saw lights flicker in the cabin windows at odd hours. Adults shook their heads and said, "That man prefers to be left alone." Daniel Brooks had lived there for 5 years. Long enough for myths to replace facts. Some said he had a temper. Some said he chased off hunters with a rifle. Others claimed his first family disappeared under unclear circumstances. None of it had ever been proven. Sheriff reports showed no arrests. No complaints. Just a man who paid his property taxes on time and declined invitations to town events. But silence, in a place addicted to chatter, becomes suspicious. Why would a man choose isolation unless he had something to hide? Why would he never correct the rumors? Emily asked herself those questions the night before her wedding as she packed a single suitcase. She wasn't imagining romance. She was bracing for exile. This wasn't a new chapter, it felt like sentencing. Permanently relocated from the only world she knew to a mountain where even the wind sounded unfamiliar. And yet, beneath her fear, there was something else. Curiosity. Because if Daniel Brooks was truly as dangerous as they claimed, why had there never been proof? Why had no one actually gone looking for answers? But the truth about the man on that mountain was buried under years of silence. The morning she left town, the sky was a pale gray, the kind that makes everything feel unfinished. There was no decorated car, no celebration. Just a rented carriage arranged by her father to make the departure appear traditional rather than transactional. The driver avoided eye contact as he loaded her suitcase. As the wheels rolled over the cobblestone road, Emily kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale, listening to the faint creak of wood and leather. The town square passed slowly. She saw Mrs. Harper from the bakery whisper something to a man outside the barber shop. 2 teenage boys nudged each other and glanced at the carriage. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. That's her. Poor thing. Or maybe, serves her right. Rumors had grown louder in the week leading up to this. At the diner, she overheard someone say Daniel once scared off 2 hunters who wandered onto his property. Men twice his size, the waitress added dramatically. At church, a woman claimed he smashed a neighbor's truck windshield years ago during an argument. There was never evidence. Just stories. And stories, repeated enough, become truth in small towns. With every mile the carriage climbed, the air grew cooler. The scent of pine thickened. Emily felt fear settle into her chest, steady and controlled. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't even crying. She had moved past protest into quiet acceptance. This was her life now. Punishment disguised as duty. She imagined what waited at the top, a shouting man, a slammed door, rules barked like commands. She prepared herself for cruelty because cruelty was familiar. It was predictable. Kindness, on the other hand, would have confused her. When the carriage finally stopped at the edge of the clearing, she saw the cabin for the first time in full daylight. It wasn't decaying or abandoned. It was maintained. Fresh wood stacked neatly by the porch. Windows clean. A faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Daniel stepped outside before the driver could knock. He didn't storm forward. He didn't glare. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, as if unsure how close he was allowed to stand. "You made it up safely," he said evenly. No sarcasm. No menace. Just a statement. Emily searched his face for signs of instability, for the rage the town had promised, but found something else. Restraint. He carried her suitcase without brushing against her. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and soap. A small vase of wildflowers sat on the table, slightly crooked, as if placed by someone who wasn't used to decorating. "You can take the bedroom," he added. "I'll use the couch until you're comfortable." The words unsettled her more than anger would have. She had rehearsed arguments in her mind, defensive responses, ways to endure harshness. But there was nothing to push against. That evening, he cooked a simple dinner: chicken, potatoes, green beans, and left space between them at the table. When she flinched at the sound of a log shifting in the fireplace, he quietly explained, "The wood pops when there's sap inside." He wasn't cold. Just careful. As if he had learned the hard way what people were capable of. That carefulness made her suspicious. People weren't gentle without a reason. Not in her experience. As night settled over the mountain, she studied every detail with strategic caution. The windows had simple latches. The back door opened toward the trees. She noted where her suitcase was placed, how close it sat to the entrance. When Daniel said, "I'll be in the workshop for a while," she wondered if that was an excuse to test her boundaries. She barely slept that first night. The mattress felt unfamiliar beneath her, and every distant rustle of wind through branches sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, she sat up and slipped her shoes on quietly. Her heart pounded, not from immediate danger, but from anticipation of it. She had already decided that if he raised his voice, if he touched her without permission, if he revealed even a fraction of the monster she had been promised, she would run. She would take the path she memorized from the carriage ride and make it back to town by sunrise if she had to. She even whispered to herself, "Be ready." But the shouting never came. The door to the workshop remained closed. The only sound was the steady rhythm of a hammer striking wood somewhere in the distance, then silence. Morning arrived gently. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains. And Daniel was asleep on the couch, still fully clothed, as if guarding the house rather than claiming it. Emily stood there, confusion replacing fear. Why would a dangerous man offer space? Why would someone with something to hide behave as though he expected to be judged? That question lingered in her mind long after breakfast. And maybe you're asking it too. If you were in her position, would you trust the calm? Or would you wait for it to crack? Days on the mountain settled into a rhythm so quiet it almost felt unreal. Daniel woke before sunrise. She could hear the soft scrape of a chair and the low hum of the kettle long before she opened her eyes. By the time she stepped into the kitchen, breakfast was already plated. Eggs, toast, sometimes oatmeal with sliced apples. He would nod once and then step back, busying himself with rinsing a cup or adjusting the firewood. He never sat across from her while she ate. Never watched. It was as if he understood what it felt like to be observed too closely. At first, she assumed it was strategy. A performance. A way to disarm her. But days passed, then weeks, and the performance never slipped. If she coughed, he asked from a distance, "Are you all right?" If she stepped outside without a sweater, she would later find one folded neatly over the back of her chair. One evening, when the temperature dropped unexpectedly, she noticed an extra blanket placed near the fireplace before she even realized she was cold. He didn't announce these gestures. He didn't look for gratitude. He simply anticipated discomfort and quietly reduced it. And that unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Because cruelty was loud. This was intentional silence. Why would a man rumored to scare hunters twice his size move through his own home like he was afraid to take up space? The mystery deepened in the smallest details. Daniel avoided eye contact in prolonged conversations, especially if the topic turned personal. If she dropped a plate accidentally, the sharp crash made him stiffen instantly, shoulders rising, breath hitching just slightly before he forced himself to relax. Once, When thunder cracked unexpectedly above the cabin, she saw him flinch and grip the edge of the table as though bracing for something worse. It lasted only a second, but she saw it. Fear. Not aggression. Fear. "You don't like storms?" she asked carefully. He paused before answering. "They're loud," he said, as if that explained everything. He spoke little but noticed everything. When she cut her finger slicing vegetables, he appeared beside her with a clean cloth before she could ask. Yet he never touched her skin directly without permission. "May I?" he asked softly, holding the cloth out rather than pressing it himself. She nodded, surprised by the question. That night, lying awake, she replayed the day in her mind. This was not a man eager to dominate. This was someone measuring every movement. She didn't realize, he was more afraid of hurting her than she was of him. But why? What had taught him that closeness led to damage? About 2 months into her life on Black Ridge Mountain, she found the first thing that unsettled her all over again. In the corner of the bedroom closet sat a small wooden chest she hadn't noticed before. It was simple, hand-built, with a sturdy brass lock. Not decorative. Protective. She ran her fingers over the surface, feeling the grooves where the wood had been sanded smooth. Why lock something inside a house that no one visited? Her heart quickened with the old narrative. Secrets. Proof. Evidence of the man the town described. She didn't try to open it. Not yet. But the presence of it shifted something fragile between trust and doubt. Later that week, while he worked in the workshop, she brought him water. As he reached for the glass, she noticed the scars on his hands. Thin, pale lines crossing his knuckles and running along his fingers. Not the roughness of carpentry alone, these were older, deeper. "Does it still hurt?" she asked before thinking. He looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly. He didn't elaborate. She didn't press. But her mind filled the silence with possibilities. Fights? Violence? Self-defense? The town's stories crept back in, unwelcome but persistent. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Then came the books. It was nearly midnight when she woke to the faint glow of lamplight beneath the crack of the living room door. She stepped out quietly and saw him sitting at the table, reading. Not manuals. Not hunting guides. Poetry. A worn collection of American classics, pages annotated in small, careful handwriting. She caught phrases as she stepped closer, lines about grief, about endurance, about learning to live after loss. He closed the book quickly when he noticed her. "Sorry," he murmured. "Did I wake you?" She shook her head, but her thoughts were racing. The man the town described as volatile was reading quietly in the middle of the night, as if hiding softness were safer than displaying it. Who was he protecting himself from? The world? Or his own memories? And what was inside that locked chest that he guarded more carefully than his reputation? If you were her, standing in that dim lamplight, would you confront him? Or would you wait, hoping the truth would reveal itself without forcing it? By the 3rd month, the questions were louder than the rumors had ever been. They followed her while she folded laundry. They lingered while she swept the wooden floors. They echoed when she stared at that locked chest in the closet. Kindness without explanation can feel like a riddle. And riddles demand answers. One late afternoon, as golden light filtered through the trees and dust floated gently in the air of his workshop, she decided silence had lasted long enough. Daniel was sanding the edge of a table leg, movement steady, controlled. She stood at the doorway for a moment, watching the careful rhythm of his hands. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" she asked finally. Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. The sanding stopped. The air seemed to thicken between them. He didn't look up immediately. He set the sandpaper down with deliberate calm, wiped his hands on a cloth, and only then met her eyes for a fraction of a second before glancing away again. Seconds passed. Long enough to feel intentional. Long enough to feel heavy. She expected defensiveness. Maybe even irritation. Instead, he inhaled slowly and said, "You deserved a choice." That was all. No elaboration. No explanation about why he said yes. Just that single sentence. And something inside her shifted so suddenly it almost hurt. She deserved a choice. No one had framed it that way before. Not her parents. Not the pastor. Not even herself. The entire arrangement had been presented as obligation, as correction, as necessity. But he had seen something different. She searched his face for sarcasm, for hidden meaning, but found none. "That's not what I asked," she pressed gently. He nodded once. "I know." Another pause. "If I had refused, they would have found someone else." The words were simple, but the implication struck deeply. He hadn't accepted her as property. He had intervened. The realization made her stomach tighten. "You don't even know me," she whispered. This time he did look at her, longer than usual. "I know what it looks like when someone doesn't get to decide their own life." The statement hovered there, unfinished. She thought of the way he flinched at loud noises. The way he measured every movement. The way he slept on the couch without complaint. And for the first time, she wondered if his silence wasn't secrecy, but restraint learned from pain. But why would a feared recluse care about her freedom? What had he lived through that made him recognize her lack of it so clearly? That night, she couldn't stop replaying the conversation. The mountain air felt different, lighter and heavier at the same time. She realized she had been waiting for evidence of danger when the real revelation was protection. Not loud, heroic protection. Quiet, preventative protection. He had stepped into an arrangement that benefited him socially, ended rumors, restored some standing, yet he had given her space from the beginning. No demands. No pressure. If anything, he had seemed prepared for her to leave. And that raised another question. If he believed she deserved a choice, would he let her go? The next morning, she tested it. "If I wanted to leave," she asked carefully while he poured coffee, "would you stop me?" The room went still. He placed the kettle down gently. "No," he answered. No hesitation. No negotiation. Just certainty. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Because freedom offered without resistance feels different than freedom fought for. It forces you to confront what you truly want. And maybe you can relate to that moment, when someone finally gives you the option you've always claimed to want, and suddenly the decision feels heavier than the cage ever did. She looked at the door. She looked at the path beyond the trees. And for the first time since arriving, leaving didn't feel urgent. It felt complicated, days blurred into a rhythm that was almost peaceful. They repaired the cabin together, each task simple but grounding. She held nails while he hammered, and sometimes their hands brushed, briefly, unintentionally, and she didn't flinch. Windows were scrubbed until the glass gleamed, the frames painted a muted green that matched the forest beyond. Shelves were tightened, floors swept, and every corner of the cabin became a little more theirs, though it was unclear whose life it really belonged to. Evenings were quieter, shared over small meals of roasted vegetables, eggs, or bread fresh from the oven. Daniel spoke less than she expected, yet when he did, his words were deliberate, measured, and careful. She noticed how he always waited for her to start eating before taking a bite, how he adjusted the blankets by the fire just so, how he made sure the lamplight didn't cast shadows over her side of the table. Laughter began to return to her, soft at first, a surprise to herself, and then more freely, sometimes spilling over into the kind of chuckle she thought she had lost after so many years of feeling overlooked. It was in those moments, while sanding a shelf or scraping old paint from a window frame, that she began to see him differently. Not as the monster the town had whispered about, but as someone cautiously navigating the same world she had been forced into. And yet, tension lingered beneath the surface. There were moments when she caught him staring out the window at the trees beyond the clearing, hands curled lightly around the ledge, jaw tight, eyes distant. She saw the flicker of memory in the way he moved when the wind rattled branches or a log creaked in the fireplace. The locked chest remained in the corner of her room, a silent testament to mysteries she had yet to uncover. And sometimes, late at night, she would hear the faint rustle of pages turning from the other room, the subtle sound of someone who read not for work, but to escape. She wanted to trust him fully, but she couldn't ignore the questions. Why did he retreat from sudden noise? Why did he flinch when shadows shifted? Why did he lock a chest she was so curious about? Who was this man beyond the quiet kindness, the gentle gestures, the evenings filled with shared silence and unexpected laughter? Her curiosity was a quiet hum beneath the cabin's peace, and it would not be silenced. She began to feel warmth, but also caution. Trust, she realized, wasn't given, it was earned, one small act at a time. And just when she started to believe that maybe this life on the mountain wasn't punishment after all, she would sense the weight of his untold past pressing down like the trees surrounding them. What happened 3 weeks later would change how she saw him forever. One rainy afternoon, Emily lingered in the cabin longer than usual, the scent of damp pine seeping through the open window. Daniel had gone to gather firewood, and she noticed a corner of the chest that had always been locked protruding slightly from beneath a loose floorboard. Curiosity overpowered caution. She lifted the lid. Inside were papers neatly stacked, yellowed with age, and a folded newspaper clipping. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the brittle sheets. Legal documents, letters, court filings. And then the clipping, a photograph of Daniel, no, not Daniel Brooks, his real name, Jonathan Hale, beneath a headline praising him for standing up against a local land developer who had attempted to crush a small family-owned business. There were signatures, dates, and stories of threats he had faced from influential figures in town. The picture of the man everyone had whispered about for years was not the recluse they imagined. He had been a respected carpenter, a man of principle. He had defended the vulnerable when no one else dared. And the town had turned on him. Whispers, rumors, lies, all tools to force him into isolation. He had chosen the mountain not out of malice, but as a shield against a corruption too deep and dangerous to confront openly. Emily's chest tightened. She had expected cruelty, but instead, she uncovered integrity. And in that moment, the puzzle clicked into place. The monster they feared was the only man who had ever stood for what was right. Fear dissolved into understanding. Suspicion gave way to something steadier. Safety. She no longer felt like a prisoner in his house. She felt protected. And for the first time, she wondered if the life she had once believed was punishment could, in fact, become a place of trust, warmth, and truth. Even as the truth settled in her mind, Emily's heart felt unsettled. She sat by the fire one evening, the warm glow reflecting in her eyes, and whispered to herself, almost afraid to hear the answer, "Am I only here because they didn't want me?" The question hung in the cabin like smoke, curling and twisting around her thoughts. She felt the weight of her family's decisions, the way they had treated her like a mistake to be corrected, a life to be redirected. And yet, the cabin felt different. Every careful gesture Daniel had made, every small act of consideration, reminded her that she wasn't just tolerated here. Maybe, just maybe, she was wanted. She hesitated, then added quietly, "Or am I here because I finally found where I belong?" Daniel had been nearby, fixing a loose shutter, and he paused at her words. He didn't press her. He didn't offer advice or insistence. He simply nodded once, eyes soft, understanding, and returned to his task. That silence spoke louder than any argument or declaration ever could. He wasn't trying to make her stay. He wasn't manipulating her or creating dependence. He was giving her space to make the choice herself. And that alone unsettled her in the most unexpected way. It made her want to stay, not because she was trapped, but because she felt seen. Because she felt that in this quiet, distant, careful man, she had finally found someone who respected the boundaries of her heart. And in that realization, the mountain no longer seemed a place of exile. It was a sanctuary. Yet even with that warmth, questions lingered. How much of her presence was destiny, and how much was fate stepping quietly into the spaces where her past had failed her? He wasn't trying to make her stay, and that made her want to stay even more. That night, the storm arrived with a sudden ferocity, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain pounding against the roof. The cabin was plunged into darkness when the power went out, leaving only the flicker of the fireplace and the occasional flash of lightning to illuminate the room. Emily hugged a blanket around her shoulders, listening to the wind tear through the pines outside, heart thudding in time with the storm. Daniel sat across from her on the floor, the fire casting shadows across his face, the scars on his hands catching the light for a brief, sharp moment. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire. Then, finally, he spoke, voice low but steady. "They called me dangerous, because I refused to be cruel." Emily froze, the words piercing through the walls she had built around herself. The silence returned, heavy and intimate, until she found her own voice, soft and almost trembling. "They called me ugly, because I refused to pretend." Their eyes met, raw and unguarded, and for the first time, the years of fear, suspicion, and misunderstanding felt irrelevant. In that shared recognition, something unspoken passed between them, two souls who had been judged, ridiculed, and misunderstood, finally seeing in each other a mirror of resilience. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the cabin held a fragile, profound calm. Here, for the first time, Emily understood that the man the town had feared was not only her protector but someone who had suffered for standing by his principles. And in that moment, she realized she was no longer afraid, not of him, not of the mountain, not of the life that had been thrust upon her. This was the emotional midpoint payoff, a quiet acknowledgement that trust, once earned, could become a lifeline, and that two broken worlds could somehow fit together in the simplest, most human of ways. Days later, just as the morning fog lifted from the mountain, the sound of hooves echoed along the gravel path. Emily froze for a moment, heart tightening. A carriage, polished and drawn by two horses, was approaching the cabin. Her parents. Her siblings. They had come expecting the girl they had cast aside, disheveled, timid, full of regret. They imagined misery etched on her face, dirt under her nails, a quiet plea in her eyes for rescue. But when the wheels creaked to a halt and they stepped onto the porch, what greeted them was nothing like the story they had rehearsed in their minds. The cabin was orderly, warm with the smell of pine and cooking bread. Emily stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes steady. Confidence radiated from her in a way they hadn't seen in years. And Daniel, Jonathan, stood beside her not as a shadowed recluse, but as a man who had earned the respect of those in the surrounding mountains, known quietly among local neighbors for his skill, integrity, and steadfastness. He greeted them politely, calmly, his presence disarming, showing them that this woman they had tried to control had flourished under his quiet guidance. Their expressions shifted from expectation to confusion, disbelief, even a touch of shame. The daughter they had thought weak was no longer theirs to manipulate. They thought they were rescuing her, but they didn't realize she no longer needed saving. And in that moment, Emily understood fully that she had found a life built not on obligation or fear, but on respect, choice, and the quiet strength of someone who had truly seen her. Her parents' voices rose in anger, clipped and sharp, demanding that Emily return with them to town. "This isn't living," her mother snapped, arms crossed, eyes flashing. "You belong with your family, Emily. You can't stay here with him." Her father leaned forward, sneer tight on his face. "We won't have our daughter trapped in some cabin up a mountain with a man no one trusts." Daniel, Jonathan, remained calm, standing beside Emily, hands folded lightly in front of him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for a folder on the counter, opened it, and laid out legal documents, deeds showing ownership of extensive mountain land, property lines including the very plots her parents had attempted to buy to expand their influence. Their expressions shifted almost instantly from righteous indignation to stunned disbelief. "These are all mine," he said quietly, voice steady. No mockery. No gloating. Simply facts. The man they had whispered about, feared, and dismissed had quietly amassed authority, legitimacy, and respect, all without harming a soul. Emily watched as their composure crumbled, realizing that the power they had wielded over her for years had evaporated the moment it collided with his quiet certainty. For the first time, they realized they had underestimated the wrong person. And in that silence, Emily felt something settle deep inside her, a sense that justice didn't require cruelty, only truth, and that she had finally found the life she deserved, grounded not in fear, but in respect, choice, and unwavering integrity. Her mother's voice cracked, desperate and sharp, "Emily, come home. Come back with us, or lose your family forever." Her father's hands shook as he gestured toward the carriage, disbelief etched across his face. The air in the cabin felt heavy, each heartbeat magnified by the storm that still whispered outside the windows. Emily stood frozen for a moment, the weight of their ultimatum pressing against her chest. Around her, the cabin remained calm, warm, a stark contrast to the turmoil in the faces before her. Then she looked at Daniel, Jonathan, his quiet presence grounding her, steadying her, reminding her of everything she had learned since stepping onto this mountain. Without hesitation, she reached for his hand, feeling the strength and patience he had offered her in every small gesture, in every act of careful kindness. Her voice was soft but unwavering as she said, "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I'm staying because this is the first place I've ever been wanted." Silence fell, thick and complete, broken only by the crackle of the fire. In that moment, the audience understands the full emotional payoff. Emily had reclaimed her life, not as someone rescued, not as someone saved, but as someone who had chosen her own home, her own path, and her own safety. And in that choice, she found empowerment, love, and a sense of belonging that no ultimatum, no threat, and no family manipulation could ever take away. Months passed, and life on Black Ridge Mountain settled into a quiet rhythm that felt natural, even sacred. Emily worked alongside Jonathan, tending the cabin, managing their small woodworking business, and slowly reclaiming the confidence that had been stifled for so long. She laughed more freely now, the sound carrying through the pine-scented air, and the shadow of her family's judgments no longer followed her. Jonathan, in turn, allowed himself to trust again, not just in her, but in the idea that connection didn't have to bring pain. The mountain, once a place whispered about in fear, became a refuge, a sanctuary shaped by respect, care, and shared resilience. Evenings were spent quietly, watching storms roll over the ridges, listening to the wind without fear, knowing that the home they had built together was theirs by choice, not obligation. And as she gazed out over the valley one autumn morning, sunlight spilling across the trees, she realized something simple but profound. Sometimes the people called monsters are simply those who refuse to become cruel. In that truth, both of them found freedom, dignity, and a peace that neither rumor nor fear could ever take away, and in the end, the girl they sent away as a joke became the woman who chose her own destiny. Not because she was unwanted. Not because she had nowhere else to go. But because she finally found where she truly belonged, among someone who saw her, respected her, and allowed her to decide her own life. The mountain, once a place of whispers and fear, had become a home. A place where trust could grow, laughter could return, and quiet acts of care spoke louder than words. And as she stood at the edge of the clearing, watching sunlight spill across the ridges, she understood that freedom wasn't about running, it was about choosing. So, now we want to ask you, what would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed, or gone back with the family? Think about that. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, because sometimes the bravest choice is simply to let humanity lead the way.